Hello, everyone. Today's guest, my first guest, is Dennis Hackethal. He is a philosopher and author of the book A Window on Intelligence. This is an exploration of how the mind works in the pursuit of artificial general intelligence. Dennis builds on the ideas of critical rationalism and David Deutsch. He's also worked together with David Deutsch for 2 years in translating The Beginning of Infinity into a German edition. In addition, he's also a skilled software engineer working for companies like Apple throughout his career. And that background also shows in how he approaches philosophy from the perspective of computation. And that is also exactly the right level of analysis when trying to understand creativity. Not the brain or the hardware level, but really on the software level of understanding the mind. In today's episode, we'll discuss how the mind works, the difference between animal and human cognition, the role of emotions and values, and the connections between objectivism and critical rationalism. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So Karl Popper already gave us a good explanation of what happens when we creatively generate new knowledge. So that's we guess or conjecture, and then we alternate that with criticism. So we're constantly guessing something and criticizing it. And this is essentially a process of evolution, so variation and selection, very similar to how genes mutate and then are selected through natural selection according to various mechanisms. But what exactly do you think is going on in the mind, and how did we ever evolve to that point? What's your ideas on that?
Yeah, so I came up with what I call the Neo-Darwinian approach to the mind. And the word Neo-Darwinian is really a nod to the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory, which was the combination of the genetic inheritance on the one hand and the Darwinian evolutionary theory on the other. And this combination really put the role of replicators center stage. And then later, people like Richard Dawkins put further importance on that. But what I noticed was that in Popper's epistemology, which, as you just described, it's an evolutionary epistemology where knowledge grows by conjecture and criticism. So we start with a problem and we conjecture solutions to the problem, and then we criticize those solutions. And hopefully, at the end of that, we have one good solution left standing. And so he has the concept of conjecture, which is analogous to genetic variation. And he has the concept of criticism, which is analogous to selection in biological evolution. But he doesn't have the third component, which is replication. Evolution is a theory about imperfect replicators. I don't know why as far as I know, he never introduced the notion of replication into his theory. I haven't read all of his books, but the ones I did read, I didn't find anything like it. It could be because, it could be because, I mean, that synthesis, the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, happened after he developed his theory. So I believe sometime in the 1940s. So maybe it's just that, there was not enough overlap, or just historically it didn't work out. I don't know. But again, I think evolution, abstractly speaking, is not about genes at all, really. It's just a theory about imperfect replicators and what happens when you, so to speak, you press play and just kind of see what happens to that pool of replicators. And so I think the Neo-Darwinian approach is a fruitful one because it gives us new ways of thinking about the mind and what may be happening there.
And what do you think may be happening in terms of like what replication is going on then in the mind?
Yeah, so I think of the mind essentially as a containing and a pool of self-replicating ideas, and these ideas, because they self-replicate imperfectly, they're subject to all the laws of evolution as we know them from biology, except it's not genes that are replicating now. It's ideas in the mind. And by that, to be clear, I don't mean that there are like nerve cells replicating in the brain or something, although I guess they do that too. I'm not an expert there. But it's literally software that's replicating in the mind. So as you alluded to earlier, I draw a sharp distinction there between the brain and the mind. I'm not really concerned with the brain as hardware at all. It's just about the mind. And so when you think of the mind as this arena of self-replicating ideas, things kind of start to click, at least for me. Things start falling into place. Like, for example, like you're convinced of certain ideas and not others because they're able to spread through your mind at the expense of their rival ideas. You forget certain things because some ideas don't manage to spread very much through your mind. Your memory is unreliable because replicators are imperfect, because they eventually make mistakes and evolve away from what they originally used to be. So memory is notoriously unreliable to the point that, like, witness statements in court get routinely found to be completely false when you actually compare them to like video footage or recordings, and people would swear that their memory is correct, but it's actually not the case. And that is an open question. Why, or was an open question, why is memory so unreliable? That's one of the features of the approach that I like the most, is that it explains memory, I think, pretty well. It just falls naturally out of, well, some ideas survive in that soup and others don't.
And what I found really interesting, you had this idea that the composition of an idea is also just a function. So a miniature computer program. I believe it's an expression. So and you can plug in some initial conditions, and then that can run, and then there's an output, and you can have as an output, like you say, a replication or a copy of that function, but also a side effect. So an action that we humans perform.
Yes. So it was when I read Popper's book, Objective Knowledge, has an appendix. Actually, I think it has two, but I think one of them, I think, is called The Bucket and the Searchlight. And I believe that was the one where he goes into what exactly you do, technically speaking, when you test a theory, when you test an idea. And he goes into, okay, you take your theory and you take your initial conditions. And as I was reading it, like, as a software engineer, I was like, this sounds remarkably similar to what you do when you test software. So in my head, I started to generalize and say, well, what, maybe it's interesting if we start thinking about this in terms of software. What if ideas are just software? What if we take that literally? And then as I developed it, I thought maybe we could take functions in the sense of the Lambda calculus as developed by Alonzo Church, which is like it's a computationally universal conception of programming. So completely computationally equivalent to Turing machines. So you can get all the advantages of computational universality in that sense. And you just take any idea because of computational universality can be expressed in this in terms of a function in the sense of the Lambda calculus. So which is a fancy term. It's really just we don't have source code here on video, but it's really just a very simple way of writing down computer code, like basically the simplest way you could write down computer code. And if you plug in initial conditions as the parameters to that function, it's a little bit like math functions, really, I guess. And if you plug in initial conditions and then check the return value, those are like the outcomes of experiments. So that's where that originated. And you can see, okay, do those outcomes match what we expected? Do they actually match what we expected given the initial conditions? If they didn't, then we need to refine something. And then you can get into the whole thing of, there's a structure to these computer programs, and we can improve the structure as well, not just the return values and the initial conditions and so forth. And that's what a lot of software engineering is about at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And also, I think the implications of this are very interesting, because if we think of everything that's or not everything, but a large part of our personality, our behavior, our ideas are actually little tiny computer programs, these Lambda functions, and they're basically in the mind and they're evolving. But what is causing the evolutionary pressure in the case of our mind? What is the selective pressure?
Right. So the selection, in the sense that some ideas reproduce more than others, is caused partially by certain properties of those ideas. So I believe Richard Dawkins explained in his book, The Selfish Gene, that like the three driving forces in evolution are hopping fidelity, fecundity, which means like the high rate of reproduction, and longevity. So any replicator that has those one, or ideally more of those three properties, will outcompete the others. So that is certainly happening in the mind as well. And then you have things like competition for, I think, memory in the sense of storage space, because the brain has limited capacity. And then there's other maybe, I mean, just pure speculation, but maybe pruning of certain ideas where some ideas are more predatory in the sense that, you know, they actively go out and destroy other ideas. That's their adaptation for survival, and other ideas may be more cooperative.
Those are very interesting aspects. I think one other dimension of your theory, which I really liked and felt like it clicked into place, was this meta algorithm, or somewhat like our consciousness. So, of course, all these functions, in order for them to be replicated, they need to be, or they likely will need to be executed at some point. So, what is actually doing the prioritization of what is being executed? I think you have an interesting theory of that as well.
Yeah, well, when you hit on the meta algorithm, that hits the nail on the head. I mean, so because we evolved from animals, and animals learn quote unquote very differently from how humans learn, but there's still, when we were still animals and we evolved from them, we must have shared that same starting point. And animals typically learn by reinforcement. And so typically a standard reinforcement algorithm would be like, you have some sort of policy, like what you could do and with what priority you would do it. So these are like the strengths or the weights that you might assign. And as certain actions get reinforced, that mean they get more weight and they have higher priority to get repeated. Whereas things that are punished or weakened get lower on the list of priorities. And so then you have this meta algorithm that looks at this list of priorities and then decides accordingly what to invoke, what to do in a given situation. Now, in humans, what happened is, I think, as a theory at least, is that this list of ideas became theoretically infinitely long. Practically, it's still finite because of that limited memory space. But in theory, there could be any number of ideas. Any ideas your mind might evolve could end up on that list. But the overall structure is still there. There's still a meta algorithm that decides what to run when. And so that meta algorithm, I think, in animals must have a sort of pruning as a safety mechanism, must have a sort of pruning mechanism. If you have tried this, for example, with dogs, if you teach them a trick, like there was a dog once, if you tell it to spin around in a circle, it'll do it. And you could tell it maybe, I forget, 10 times, but at some point it'll stop doing it. Even if you tell it repeatedly.
Yeah.
It'll just
There's
stop.
like some fail safe, right?
There's some there must be some safety mechanism that shuts that down. And I think that humans still have some underlying mechanisms like that the meta algorithm will step in and take care of those scenarios. And for scenarios like that, I could see the meta algorithm actively stepping in, pruning certain ideas from the idea pool.
And is the meta algorithm, if that's the thing that's also deciding what gets prioritized in terms of actions, is that the same as consciousness, or do you think consciousness and the meta algorithm are somewhat different?
Well, that's where it's really interesting. I mean, I don't know. I don't know for sure. Consciousness is where it gets really tricky. I mean, it's this notion of a meta algorithm certainly lends itself to this idea that maybe consciousness lives somewhere in that, because at least from experience, it seems like consciousness gives us this top-down view that a meta algorithm might have. Mm-hmm. But I just don't know. Consciousness is just too much of a mystery still at this point.
That's true. But in the book, you do offer, at least in my view, the most compelling description of the function of consciousness, at least what we do know of it, that I've come across, which is basically the criticism mechanism, right? So at least a large part of that there's something consciously in our mind and we can use it to criticize it and to choose what we act on.
Certainly, consciousness seems to have to do with some sort of critical attitude, maybe. And you can see that as opposed to animals, for example, they do not have a critical attitude. I think animals are basically like robots. They function purely on instinct and pre-existing programming. They have no ability to do any critical reflection. And when you study animals and you do experiments with them, where you see evidence, you see footage, there's tons of videos of this online, where if you take an animal and you even what seems like really sophisticated behavior and you take it out of the context for which it evolved, it looks completely idiotic. and this is when you see that animals have absolutely no critical ability, and hence why I think also inspired by David Deutsch here, I don't think that animals have any sort of sentience or consciousness. And I know usually that people can't believe that anyone would actually think that, and and usually they immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, it must be because he just hasn't really thought about it much, or because he doesn't know animals that well. No, I can. To the incredulous, I can assure you, I've thought about it quite a bit, and I've owned animals, I've studied animals.
You actually have a really good blog post on your blog that is like a FAQ. Like, I thought about everything. Here's kind of, or not everything.
Yeah,
but
all the commonly addressed
yeah.
criticisms and questions when it comes to animal sentience. And also, I have another post that's just a list of evidence of all the tons of videos where you see animals doing funny things. Like if you place a dog in a pool of water, it'll swim. No surprise there. But if you just hold a dog, if you take a small dog, just hold it above water, it'll also swim.
So let's see. Maybe it's nice if I try to recap what I've learned, or at least what we've heard so far. So this notion of self-replicating ideas, which are functions, and they are appealing to the meta algorithm, or to our attention, I guess is another way to put it. This makes them enacted, and therefore it also is what's driving this process, which I think Popper alludes to as the conjecture, which is like in the unconscious, something is happening where ideas are like rearranging themselves in novel forms, not in a random way, but in a targeted way to solve a specific problem. Do you also think that is what actually is going on when we're talking about conjecture? Is it that self-replicating process which is a bit error-prone and which therefore is causing some novel things to happen?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a lot of unconscious conjecture happening. I think the vast majority of the variation of ideas happens unconsciously, and some of that then become aware of later on. We only ever seem to be aware of ideas that are not total garbage.
Yeah.
So
do you think there's kind of a filter?
Yeah, there must be some filter, although it's not clear to me if it's built in or if it's acquired later in life. It might be the case that when we're young, we learn to disregard garbage ideas, and we master that to the point that it's completely automated, and then that's why we're not aware of it later in life.
Cool. Because one of the things that I found so interesting about the theory also is that what basically the problems that are in our consciousness are there for a couple of times until we have kind of mastered it. Or when we're acquiring a skill, for example, I think the learning to ride a bicycle is one of those things where you're very conscious of the movement patterns and your balance for a while, and then all of a sudden it's not anymore. But are there also aspects of learning that just never go to our consciousness, that we're just learning and internalizing a better way of doing something which does not ever appear in our minds as a conscious process?
There could be, sure. Yeah,
I think this is an interesting angle because you also have this interesting blog post on sleepwalking, right? Where there's actually a lot of individuals who, when they're sleeping, they exhibit behavior that looks actually quite creative. They're able to, at least it has illusion of problem solving, where they can walk around an object and notice, oh, it is there or it's not there, and therefore I'm going to adjust my behavior slightly to that. Do you think there's actually real-time learning going on in those cases, or would you say it's more like this is like a pattern they've learned and they can get around it?
Yeah, it's just the second one, I think people generally overestimate what consciousness is actually required for. So they think to walk around and talk, you need to be conscious to do that. And it's not, it can't be true because, as you've just said, sleepwalkers walk around all the time and they actually navigate their environment. There's a story of a girl who walked a couple miles to her uncle's house and stopped at stoplights and waited for the signal to turn green and all that. So, and she was not aware of it, and she had no memory of it later. And the reason she was able to do it is that this behavior, which obviously little children don't know how to do that. They wouldn't know the route to their uncle's house. They wouldn't know how to get there, and they wouldn't know to stop at stoplights. That's stuff they learned. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the girl was old enough. I forget how old she was, but an adult clearly is old enough to know all those things. Once you've mastered those things, by definition, you've automated them. You don't need to think about them consciously anymore. And so then you can do them automatically. That's why when people say that they've mastered something to the point they can do it in their sleep, they're not kidding. They literally could do it in their sleep. It's the same for basic conversation. I think one of Popper's books he writes about he mentions it in passing, but he says that little kids sometimes have conversations in their sleep. It could probably only be very basic conversations, like once you say something that the other person wouldn't know about or understand, and it might cause them to wake up or something. I don't know, but if they do respond, it's probably nonsense. I'm not sure. But yeah, in general, people overestimate what consciousness is actually required for. And just because you see a person or an animal exhibit some complex behavior does not mean that they're consciously enacting it. Even right now, I'm guessing, as you and I are speaking, probably 95% of what we're doing is automated and subconscious, because if it were any less than that, the conversation would be way too difficult to have in real time.
And arguably it would be very mechanical and actually not as smooth. If we would be consciously thinking about every single word and the sequence and like interpreting or trying to forecast what you are going to say and therefore come up with a response. The reason we can have this conversation is because it's not very conscious.
Yep. There's a lot of aspects that we have automated.
I think I was personally fooled a lot by this appearance of complex behavior, and therefore when I looked at animals, I thought, oh, they're learning in probably similar ways to us, or we have maybe half of our acquired knowledge and our learning is happening in a way that an animal would also do, and we just have a little part of us, which is the creativity. But I think you have a different take on this, where actually, no, almost everything we learn is completely different to animals.
Yes, so basically, I think that the way people learn and the way animals learn is completely different. Animals learn by reinforcement. So when you teach a dog a trick, you reinforce the behavior that you want by petting it or giving it treats, and you discourage behavior that you don't want through punishment. That could be through a shock collar or a stern no, or but there's built-in there's something built into the dog that detects positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and adjusts behavior accordingly. The reinforced behavior gets emphasized and repeated, and the discouraged behavior, the punished behavior, gets diminished over time until it disappears completely in some cases.
Yeah.
And that is not at all how people learn. People learn through, as we discussed earlier, conjectures and criticism. There's evolution literally happening in their minds, evolution of ideas, as Popper discovered. And that is something animals do not have. So it's a very different process.
And this reinforcement learning, it's not just like we tell the animal that's good and that's bad, but even if they would learn motor skills, like the feedback from the environment is in that case, is that what's causing the learning. So in other words, the animal is born and they have genes which code for a specific set of knowledge, like you can use your leg to move in this way and that way, and so you have a range of what you could do, and it's up to you then to figure it out through reinforcement learning. Like a robot can also actually be trained how to walk by just having a fixed range of movement, and then just trial and error, just like a neural net, almost like train yourself on doing that over and over. But this is not even how a human would learn almost the exact same motor skills.
Yeah, I mean, there's reinforcement learning on the one hand, and then there's what you just touched on as evolutionary algorithms, which David Deutsch has made a point to he emphasizes this, that what we call evolutionary algorithms in computer programming don't actually implement evolution on computers. There's something missing there. And the evidence that he has for this is that they always approach some optimum and then they get stuck and they never get out of it. Whereas actual evolution, although it also does get stuck sometimes for long periods of time, does eventually break out of those local optima.
Yeah.
So it's a bit tricky to tell, but I agree with him. I think there's some programming paradigm that we haven't discovered yet. It's difficult for programmers, especially, to think about what that might be. Ironically, you would think that programmers would be the best people to implement this, but it's actually the whole point of programming as it's currently
deterministic, right?
It's like the whole point of programming is that you write down the logic of what the computer is supposed to do in such a way that there's never any more creative input needed. And in other words, you write it down precisely in such a way that it's completely automated and the computer can do it mindlessly. Whereas with evolution, the whole point is creativity. And with conscious evolution in particular, the stuff that goes on in our minds, the whole point is that it does not do things mindlessly. but that it can introspect and criticize and reflect and so on. And that's something we just have no idea how to do it currently. But we know that our computers must be able to do it in principle because of computational universality. We just don't know how to tell them to do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And people then often say, oh, there must be like some component of the algorithm that is just inherently random, that it just will try something new. But that's not also what's going on, because it's very targeted. At least our ideas are at solving a specific problem. We have a problem in mind, or at least there's a problem situation ahead of us, and we really are trying to solve that problem. And the conjectures or the ideas are aimed at that, right?
Well, it looks like that. On like higher levels of emergence, it looks like that in evolution, that there's like some goal-directed evolution happening. But on the lower levels, there must be some random component, because the variation happens without regard for the problem situation. And then the selection happens after the fact, happens after the variation has already occurred. And that's how design arises. And then it looks like there was goal directedness toward a solution there, but that happened later.
Gotcha. Right. So there's definitely layers at which random is inherent in these functions, but I mean we just don't know that much about conjecture and refutation, because even if you try to break it down into like a creative step and a criticism step, then you run into the issue that, okay, but the criticism is based on some other idea you creatively came up with, right?
It's already highly
like
adapted. Yeah. Yeah.
So it must be a very complex interplay constantly going on.
Absolutely. I've seen, I want to say it was a video, some account of a bear that was in a zoo for the longest time, in like a very confined space, and it would always walk in a circle in that space. And later, that same bear was set free and just repeated walking in a circle out in the wild, where it had plenty of room to do whatever. So the question is, how do you interpret that behavior? Now, most people would say, oh, wow, that poor bear was so traumatized that it kept walking in a circle and it didn't know what else to do or whatever. I think that's exactly the result of this reinforcement. It just got so used to walking in a circle, it just kept repeating that like a robot. It couldn't break out of it.
Completely entrenched this knowledge that it created, or knowledge creation, maybe not the right word, but the information that he reinforced, that this is the only way forward because I've done it a million times and it's worked a million times and there's no other way.
Yeah. What might have happened is like it went in a circle, it got fed, not actually to reinforce the behavior of going in a circle, but just because it got fed at certain times. The reinforcement algorithm in its brain misinterpreted the getting fed as, oh, I should keep walking. And then it repeated right. So I could see something like that having happened to reinforce that walking in a circle and just keep repeating that. I have another list of like dozens of examples of animals where even behavior that looks pretty complex in the situations it evolved for, when you take the animals out of those situations, it looks completely nonsensical. So for example, if you put a dog in a pool of water, it swims. And that behavior is inborn. I don't think it's learned later in life. I think that's inborn. Even puppies can do it, as far as I know. But if you just hold the dog above water, it does. Even if it doesn't touch the water, it still does the swimming motion, and it keeps doing it even though it's not moving forward. You're holding it in place. Yeah. If it were sentient, it would recognize, wait, I'm not moving. I'm not even touching the water. I might as well stop. I don't need to keep swimming in midair.
And as you say, if you would do that with a human, the only thing you could conclude is, oh, this human is not conscious. There's something inbuilt that's triggering an instinct, etc. But that human is not conscious, because otherwise they could intervene and stop that and like update their knowledge. But obviously that's not happening with the animal.
Or if he is conscious, there's something very wrong with him, because he should realize that there's no need to make the swimming motion. You don't even, it doesn't even need to be water, by the way. You can just hold the dog above like a blue surface.
Oh. And
it'll still do it. It's completely nonsensical. So the bear walking in a circle is another example. This is from a Hans Haas book. They did experiments with squirrels. And David Deutsch has referenced this too. If you raise a squirrel in isolation, and this is how you make sure that this is inborn and not copied from other squirrels. You raise the squirrel in isolation, it's never seen other squirrels or nuts, and then you give it a nut, it tries to bury the nut. But if you give it the nut and it's on a wooden floor indoors somewhere on like a
Uh-huh.
hard surface, it does the burying, it does the digging motion. There's no
Yeah.
dirt to be dug up. There's no dirt, nothing. And then it takes the squirrel and rams it into the non-existent hole, and the nut just rolls away completely, and it doesn't even notice. The squirrel does not even notice. It closes the hole with non-existent dirt and then runs off.
Oh, really? It will not even ever correct and try it again. It will just, no, I completed step 1, I'll to step 2.
Yeah. So this is really how you have to take the animals out of the context in which they evolved, and then it becomes completely apparent that there's no thinking going on whatsoever.
So their genes really have coded for these behavior chunks, I guess you could call it, where I can do this, and then in that step I can do that, and there's a bit of a range of how I could do that thing, but it's very minimal. But as soon as you go out of that range, it's apparent that this animal cannot do that. I think even apes, like they can exhibit behaviors that look quite complicated, like indeed manipulating objects and whatnot, opening up something. But as soon as you do something that they have not coded for, it's just impossible. It never will be able to do that. Like, for instance, I think they don't have strong auditory systems, so they could never learn to hum a tune or something. Like, they just have nothing in their genes coded for that. Whereas or humans, of course, are completely universal. This also leads to the question of how it evolved. Because in the beginning of Infinity, or David Deutsch's at least account of or explanation of it, I believe that we evolved creativity in order to interpret behaviors of others better. So therefore we could transmit cultural ideas or memes better. So at some point it became so important for us to interpret well what someone else was doing that we evolved universal creativity to interpret that. But I believe you have a different take on how we evolved creativity.
I don't know if I have a different view on that. I think Deutsch's theory makes sense there. It sounds, as I recall it, in his book, he was agnostic as to how exactly creativity may have evolved. He just says once it did evolve, it was immediately used for the purpose of copying memes, because memes were already evolving at that point, and because some animals have memes, so did our ancestors.
Yes,
but they copied them non-creatively, but they were already so important in our evolutionary history that once you had creativity on the scene, it was automatically used to copy memes. And then they were copied not by blindly imitating behavior, but by understanding the purpose of a behavior and then enacting it, which is something only humans can do. Even animals that have memes, so as I understand it, the grooming behavior in cats is mimetic, not genetic. So don't quote me on this, but I believe if you raise a kitten in isolation, it will not know how to clean itself. It learns that from its mother, I believe. So that's an example of a meme in animals. And our ancestors had similar things, maybe not grooming behavior, but similar, like maybe they were hunting behaviors or something like that, you could imagine. So I could see that being the case. The way I picture creativity evolving, this pool of self-replicating ideas, what I had in mind was, so one prominent theory of how evolution started occurring in the biosphere, biological evolution, is called the RNA world hypothesis. The idea there was, or is, that you in the so-called primordial soup, basically the ancient oceans or the ancient waters of the earth, you had those were highly chemically active, and you had all these different molecules floating around, and some of those molecules were catalysts. I'm not a chemist, but as I understand it, a catalyst is like something that facilitates a chemical reaction without undergoing any net change itself. So it retains the ability to cause a chemical reaction again. Now, some of those catalysts in that primordial soup were special in the sense that they catalyzed reactions that resulted in the creation of the components of which they themselves were made. And if that process ever gets more targeted, just happens randomly to get more targeted, at some point it makes sense to call these catalysts replicators. And so that's how you get replicators that are targeted enough, and then from that point, just evolution just kicks in, because you automatically get imperfections. No replicator is perfect. That's how you get variation, and then some variants are going to be better at spreading through the population than others. That's how you get selection. And that's how the complexity of life evolved over time. And so I think of the evolution of creativity to have occurred basically the same way, except not with genes or any sort of molecule or material replicator, but with ideas. So I believe, I guess, that there was some in one of our ancestors in their brain, or in the software that ran on their brain, there were instructions that acted just like the chemical catalysts from the primordial soup, in the sense that they coded for well, not behavior, they coded for the creation of more code. And some of that code happened to be the source code of which those let's call them proto-replicators were themselves made of. And if that process ever became more targeted, you then get, it makes sense to call them actual replicators. Only now we're talking about replicators on a software level. Again, not any hardware sense. And those replicators, once target enough, the same thing happens again. You get actual replication, and along with that comes variation and selection. And that's how evolution started, I think, in our minds. And from that point on, it makes sense to consider our ancestors creative, because they had that evolution of ideas occurring in their minds.
And this does make sense, because what's not controversial is that what makes humans unique is our cognitive abilities. And even before we were creative, we were more cognitively able than other species. At least that's what differentiated us. We could cooperate, or we had a higher capacity for memory and inborn knowledge, and there was this selective pressure going on for making us more and more capable of like these cognitive functions, and meme is what meme transmission or cultural idea transmission is one of those functions. So I can definitely see how there is some mechanism inside us that's always trying out just slightly new variants of ideas or behaviors that could give us an evolutionary advantage, and that kicks off in this RNA world sense, this idea that, okay, we're trying these ideas, but we also have some random variation going on. Just want to try some new variants, see if something happens that is good. And there's evolutionary pressure because, of course, our mind is a limited resource. So this is already causing error correction, I believe, because there is a thing that creates new knowledge, and there's some mechanism for retaining what is useful. And at some point that switched to, okay, now we have this catalyst that's being created, or at least reenacting itself, and now it really kicked off creativity.
Yeah, and then it plugs into the theory by David Deutsch, where once you have this pool of self-replicating ideas, you are able, in the first place, to understand the purpose of somebody else's behavior. The animals that don't have this pool of self-replicating ideas, they can never understand anything. They can, not only could they not understand the purpose of another animal's behavior, they just don't understand, period. But humans, once they had that, they could understand the purpose of somebody else's behavior, and that is an extreme shortcut to enacting that behavior, rather than blindly copying it. So that gave us a huge evolutionary advantage.
Absolutely, because if you then look at someone jumping in the river and coming out with a fish, you can conjecture or come up with a reason for why they might be jumping in the river, and how they could have gotten that fish, instead of having to literally have like hundreds of generations of your species die before someone else actually parse together those sequences of events.
And this plugs in nicely with Popper's idea that we can let our theories die in our place.
I found it very interesting that because your theory really gives some in-between steps to that big jump of creativity occurring. Because it's not trivial, because otherwise we would have understood it by now. We would have understood AGI, consciousness, which seems heavily intertwined, but we do not. So we need to also be mindful of the intermediate steps that got us there. Do you have any pet theories or angles which you think are promising in current AGI research, or maybe your own ideas currently?
Well, let me first say that I followed David Deutsch in believing that everything that is currently labeled AI and even AGI is completely misguided. I don't believe any of it has any promise to actually getting us to truly conscious / creative algorithms. He wrote a really good article in Aeon magazine, or Aeon, I don't know how to pronounce that, the name of the magazine, but it was called Creative Blocks. How close are we to creating artificial intelligence, I think, or artificial general intelligence? was the title of the article. And he said, no, what's really needed is not more computing power, not more data. What we really need is a philosophical breakthrough. It's not a programming problem right now. It's not like we already know how to write the thing. We just don't have enough data, or we don't have enough processing power. That's not the issue. We don't understand. Somebody needs to explain how the mind works, and then you can write it down as a computer. Then that explanation, you formalize it and write it down as a computer program. Although even with it's actually with the formalization already gets us into tricky terrain, because creativity that's truly formalized is, by formalizing creativity, you kind of break it. This gets back into this. Yeah, it's because then you just tell it what to do, and then it just does it mindlessly. It has to have a certain amount of freedom to decide what it wants to do. This is where it gets back to the thing I mentioned earlier about we need a new programming paradigm, and we just don't know what it is.
No, but you also believe that consciousness is a big factor in this, as in, like, if we understand consciousness, probably we understand AGI and vice versa.
Yeah, I also think it's a package deal. Yeah, it's a binary thing, and if you it might not matter if you understand consciousness first, you get creativity, or vice versa. If you program creativity, you get consciousness automatically. One of those. Yeah.
It's maybe a sidetrack, but I was listening to the Reason is Fun podcast with David Deutsch and Lulie Tanett, and they were talking about also like the ways in which certain ideas in our minds, you have the explicit ideas, which are like expressible in text and symbols, but there's also inexplicit ideas like images, etc. So that there must be different almost programming languages also in our minds. Have you given thought to the idea that there are just, as in a typical computer program, there's also like low-level code and higher-level code and etc.
I haven't listened to that episode. Can you say a bit more about what they have in mind there?
So it's clear that explicit ideas have their own language, because the natural language is one of those languages in which they can be expressed, and of course math and computation is another one. But inexplicit ideas, so an image, etc., they must be expressible in some language, because at root level it will be running on the operating system of our brain, which probably is some binary system. But then I think the question that I was left asking, like, okay, but is there maybe some higher level language? I mean, it's probably not going to be Turing complete, otherwise it would be that explicit language, but maybe there is some way of representing indeed more abstract ideas in a language.
Yeah, I could see that. I really don't know. It could also vary from person to person, because it might be that some person comes up with one way to deal with problems and another does it a different, like people have different methodologies. So I could see one person having like developing one inexplicit programming language for some things and another for other things.
Yes, that's also what I came up with. If there is such a language, it's probably emergent. Right? Everybody will come up with their own. It's not like we are born with English language or with computation.
We must be born with some.
Yeah.
We must be born with some programming language running on our brain.
Yes.
I think all animals are, and even more primitive organisms. There's be interesting to think about if there's any organism where there's no computation going on at all. I don't think I could think of any. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely organisms that don't even have like a brain, like you think of an amoeba or something, like really primitive organisms. But I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think even they have ways to process signals from the environment. And so once there's any kind of information processing going on, information processing is just another word for computation. So,
and cell coordination is already information processing.
Yeah.
So it's super decentralized, actually. I didn't realize. I thought of always there's some central processing unit, like the central nervous system, that's dictating it. But actually it turns out that every individual cell basically is very good at listening to specific signals from its environment, in the sense of like currents, and so it's basically, it has its own inbuilt programming to do what it's told, and it's not just passively waiting. It can actually be reconditioned to do something completely different. Oh, we're getting now into the research of Michael Levin, which I'm passionate about, but it is just interesting to show also the computational universality and the intelligence that's even within a single cell.
So how could you reprogram the cell to do other things like that?
So there's this experiment he describes with what they do in the lab with tadpoles, where they can make like Picasso tadpoles. I think when it's still in like the embryo state, they're able to apply electrical current very precisely to the cell. And by doing so, they can move the nose, etc., to all different places just by the current that they put next to the developing cell or developing embryo. And it can actually also then, if you change the signal, it can go back in place. So it was actually really remarkable how much you could.
Like they can change where the nose ends up growing.
Yes, the morphology was like completely messed up, or as in, or yeah.
That's
he
cool.
has fascinating experiments about that, where he's really just showing it's just indeed the current or the voltage. It's causing these things.
Yeah, neat. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. That also, just knowing that intelligence is also a bit more decentralized also helps understand how we do our motor movements, because not everything is going through this central processing. Well, maybe it's all going through there. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
As I recall from high school biology class, if I remember correctly, like reflexes don't go through the brain. I think there's a shortcut to the spine, and then it goes directly to the limb that has to move. Yes,
these experiments where there's these poor animals with a broken spine, but if you put them on a treadmill, they'll still walk, even though there's like no connection to the brain. There are these experiments that have been done where they show this.
Yeah, I've seen some. Yeah. I've read some of the things about eels where if you, I may be getting the details wrong, but I think if you chop off the head and then place the torso, quote unquote, in water, it still does the swimming motion automatically once there's a current.
Yeah.
So clearly, whatever causes the swimming motion can't be coming from the brain. It must be more decentralized than that. Yeah.
Yeah. That also again brings us a bit back to the unconscious learning and what like. Yeah, we kind of understand it's going on, or at least once it's learned, it's unconscious. But then where is it localized and like how's it invoked? Does it all still pass through the function pool and the meta-awareness algorithm? That's a tricky question, I think.
Yeah.
It also comes into play when we think about, okay, how do we undo or override unconscious behavior patterns or habits, I think is the more common way to say it. Like, do you think there is a way that we can directly access unconscious knowledge and somehow manipulate it? Or is it only possible like indirectly where we create a competing idea, so to say, or competing theory, which over time we reinforce to kind of replace that old idea?
Well, I wouldn't put it in terms of reinforcement. Maybe practice is a better way to put it.
Practice. Okay. Yeah.
We definitely don't have 100% visibility into our own minds, and there's a ton we don't know about ourselves, and kind of by definition, the unconscious ideas are a big part of that. What you can do is you can gain a little bit of visibility by by thinking about it, like through logic. Let's say, like by process of elimination, you could say, well, it couldn't have been that idea, so it must have been this other idea. Or like, what was I thinking in that moment? If it couldn't have been that one, it must have been that idea. You can do stuff like that. But yeah, there's definitely limited visibility into our own minds there.
Yeah. I think that indeed there's so much that we of our behavior or unconscious knowledge that drives our behavior that we're not aware about. Like I think consumer choices in economics is a very clear one. Like if you knew what your customer wanted, it would be trivial to start a business, but it's actually quite difficult because the individual themselves don't know what they want. They can fill in a million questionnaires. It's not going to really express what they want because they don't know what they want.
Yeah. There's a question of knowledge. There's a question of honesty too. You might and like what people think honesty is about. There's a great essay by Richard Feynman called Cargo Cult Science, where he goes into more detail what honesty actually means. Like most people think honesty just means, somebody asks you a question and then you think about it for 2 seconds, and the answer that you readily think of without purposely fooling yourself, that's honesty. If you just relay that answer, but that's not good enough, not really, because people lie to themselves a lot, and they come up with these really intricate ways of lying to themselves, and as a result, they lie to other people. So he says, like, honesty is, or like you can technically say the truth, but still plant lies in other people's heads, right? So he gives examples from marketing and advertising where people do that. So he says that honesty is really about making like a good effort to arrive at the truth and communicate the truth, and that's more than just relying on snap judgment.
Yeah. So, but it's relying on honest criticism, I guess, of really taking the idea seriously and trying to steelman it as best as you can, and then what's left, that's what you
Yeah.
is your honest idea.
Yeah. I remember being frustrated when I first moved to San Francisco. San Francisco is known for being really flaky, people being unreliable.
Oh,
It's kind of a stereotype, but it's true. And I remember being really frustrated with that when I first moved there. And I didn't know how to verbalize it at the time, but I think what bothered me about it was the dishonesty with it. Because when you ask somebody there, or first of all, people are kind of disingenuous. They say, "Oh, we should totally hang out." And they don't mean it. They never actually follow up. They're just signaling a mild interest to maybe hang out one day, right? That's what they're really saying, which is fine. Once you know that that's what to expect and you understand the rules of the game, then it's fine and you're not as frustrated. And they don't actually mean, there's no malicious intention there. They don't actually mean to mislead you or anything. But they are lying in the sense that, like, if you know somebody's a flake and you know that let's say they've stood you up 3 times in a row already, and then you ask, and then they suggest a 4th time to meet, and you ask, well, are you actually going to make it this time? They say, oh no, yeah, totally. This time I'm going to make it. But you already know they're lying, and it's not that they're lying. Is not in the sense that they're maliciously trying to mislead you, but lying in the sense that they haven't taken the steps that they would need to take to accurately tell you the truth.
yes.
And if they had taken that, they would know that they're that they're a flake and that they're unreliable and that they need to change something about themselves, right?
Agreed. And what I find irritating about this is that they're doing it to protect themselves, to still look as the good guy, because you're always keeping a smiley face and never saying something wrong, and therefore I cannot put it on you that you are not doing something correctly, but you're not being straightforward, and I just have to kind of parse this indirect language from you and making it more complex for me.
Yeah.
And to some degree, we all do that, like some social lubricant, but some cultures have it more than others. You're also from Germany, and I'm from the Netherlands, and there is one of the most, of course, honest and direct ways of communicating. So the culture shocks are maybe perhaps bigger for us.
Yeah, or you see it in the gym a lot, or with fitness, where when you ask someone, well, why didn't you go to? I mean, you wouldn't be this confrontational about it, but in essence, you ask somebody, why didn't you go to the gym this week? And then they say, "Oh, I didn't have time." They genuinely believe that they didn't have time, right? They're not lying in the conventional sense. But then you ask them, "Okay, let's look at your screen time this week. How many hours did you spend scrolling Instagram?" "Oh, 3 hours a day." Well, clearly you had time, right? So they're still lying because they didn't take the steps. They didn't think it through. If they had thought it through, they would have told you, "Yeah, no, I had time. I was just scrolling Instagram too much."
It's a foregoing of our agency and our ability to be creative and question everything. It's just like, oh no, there's this part of me that's deterministic, and I just have this amount of time in a day.
Right. I couldn't help it. Yeah.
I do have one interesting. I read into evolutionary biology also quite a bit, and there's this concept of self-deception that also emerges there, and it's not just bluffing, where like you're not really as tough as you are, but you're just hiding it to get to have a higher standing in society or something like that. There's actually self-deception going on where you have no idea that you are actually being overconfident. So there is the genetic reason to have this, and that is namely to be better at deceiving others. Because if you don't know that you're lying to yourself, someone else is also not going to be able to tell. So there's actually well, at least that's the theory of this guy called Robert Trivers. He experiences, I think, with animals where they have no clue that they're not as tough as they think they are. And that served the purpose of them being better at deceiving others and getting a higher social standing.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I got to say, I'm not a huge believer in evolutionary psychology. I think it has, if any, it has very limited explanatory power when it comes to our behaviors and our ideas.
And that comes from the idea that evolutionary psychology prescribes almost on the deterministic programs that we all run, and it kind of forgoes again the creativity and agency, right? That's what you're hinting at.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's a denial of reason. It's an attack on reason. And speaking of dishonesty and dodging accountability, it lets you blame your genes for things that are really your personal responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that triggered me about the self-deception is that it opens the door for like something being maybe outside of our own, this meta-awareness that's going on that we could never poke through. I just find that idea interesting. I'm not sure that there is such a thing.
What do you mean by meta-awareness?
Well, just our universal creativity, that there is just something going on in the operating system of our brain that we cannot access because it's kind of shielded off.
Yeah. That I think that's happening for sure. Yeah. I just don't think that it's all genetically driven.
Very strong point. I totally can see that. I do wonder, when you introspect and look at your own mind, is there certain aspects of the processing going on, or hiccups maybe that occur that interest you in your day-to-day life?
Do you mean hang-ups like David Deutsch says, or do you mean hiccups like accidents and thinking?
I'll give like an example. I have this tendency to always want to do more, or to really push myself to get more done in a day. I'm wondering if there's some aspects of mind that have a similar effect on you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, personally, although it probably affects me personally too, but I forget if I read this somewhere, if I come up with this, but I always like to say, if social interactions didn't go the way you wanted them to, first thing you should do is look in the mirror. Because sometimes, if you don't get along with someone, or you had high hopes for a date or something, and oh man, there's this great show that I've been binging. There's a radio show, or they used to be, out of Seattle, I think, where they did it's called The Second Date Update, and it went kind of viral on social media. The setup is, you go on a date with someone, and then they blow you off. You don't hear back from them. You call this radio station, and they call them on your behalf to figure out why they're not getting back to you. And all the while, you're listening in. You're on the other line listening in, and eventually they surprise you, the person telling that you've been listening, that you want to talk to them. And you wouldn't believe like when they first talked to the person who called in, they asked him, can you think of anything you might have done that would have scared the other person off, or done anything that would motivate them not to get back to you? And very rarely do they mention anything. And then you hear the other person, it's like so obvious. Like there was one person who like kept taking naps during the date or something, and they never thought to mention it. Right. So that's what I mean. Is like I think people would benefit a lot from being more self-critical if social interactions don't go the way they want them to.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm on the topic. And are you aware of the literature, the research on like cognitive biases? That we have these mental shortcuts that help us simplify situations and weigh options quicker, etc. Do you have any thoughts on them?
Well, I read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, ages ago. 12, 13 years ago I read it, so it's been a while. I remember liking it at the time. That was before I read any Deutsch or Popper, though. So I wonder if I read it again today, I would probably see more issues with it. I know that David has said about, like, on the topic of biases in general, it's like they're a type of error. Like, people make errors, and there's no limit to the errors that we can make. And sometimes people make methodological errors in their thinking too. So I think that's, at the end of the day, that's really all biases are.
I agree. It's just it's just an example of all observations are theory laden, and one of the theories we have are this lens of cognitive biases, which I do still believe we have them, and I think the research of Daniel Kahneman shows that. But it raises an interesting point, like, okay, some of them are probably even innate, and some of them are acquired and very culturally reinforced. And the interesting aspect I found of their research is that even if you're aware of them, it's hard to circumvent them. The only way to basically steer clear of them, in their advice, is to pause and take the situation seriously and to use your reasoning. But you cannot train yourself or habitualize yourself to override the cognitive bias because they're just so strong and entrenched, etc. And therefore, their advice is just, if a decision is important, then just use your system to your reasoning, and that's how you avoid them. I think that actually merges the worlds of Deutsch and Kahneman a little bit.
Well, I don't know if there, from what you just said, it sounded like there's like some insurmountable barrier because of those biases. I don't know if I agree with that, or did I misunderstand you there?
Well, they come to the conclusion, and I think they say it's impossible to overrule or override the biases, like a negativity bias or something like that. As in, like, that compulsion that comes up that you overvalue something negative happening. They say you cannot override this, so it's better to just note the feeling, take all your thoughts seriously, and then reason about it in a specific way. I wouldn't go as far as say it's impossible that to get rid of the negativity bias. I think we can, but it's very difficult because they're so entrenched. That's how I think I would reconcile it. That it's impractical to get rid of our cognitive biases or to override our cognitive bias, and we better just opt for reasoning if a situation is so important.
I could see it being difficult. Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as something else that can be practiced. Sometimes I notice in conversation, you get this a lot when you discuss statistics, like for example in America, crime statistics, and sometimes when you talk to people who maybe aren't that familiar with like statistical methods, they are more prone to certain biases because they just haven't thought of, like, they don't know how to think about these things. They haven't learned that yet. But then if you think about if you learn that statistical reasoning, you can spot those pitfalls a mile away, and you also know how to avoid them. So yeah, I could see those things being difficult sometimes, but it still strikes me as a soluble problem.
Absolutely. And I think one of the cool takeaways I had from it is for intuition to be reliable or a strong way to make decisions, two parameters need to be present. Namely, it needs to be a situation you've experienced many times before. So you need to have a lot of experience. And also that situation has to be stable in the sense that the variables are not constantly changing. So like an example would be a fireman. They go through very similar circumstances many times again, and then their intuitions are very strong in those circumstances. But a political analyst, completely, it's worse than a dart throwing chimp because it's just so dynamic and varied that their intuition is worse than average because they had this overconfidence, etc.
Stock market's another example I think you like to use, Kahneman.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think if you want to rely on your unconscious learning and apply it in these situations, you better make sure that it's not a very variable or unpredictable arena where knowledge creation is happening a lot. Then your intuition can serve you well.
I could see that. Yeah.
I love thinking about like which parts of our human experience are more innate driven versus like creativity.
Gotcha.
One of those domains is emotions. So I think broadly two theories. There's one is that, okay, a lot of our emotions are innate. So we just have a very specific set of emotions like fear, anger, etc. And that's what comes up in predictable ways. But there's also this other researcher, Lisa Barrett, I believe her name is, who says, no, there's actually only two important variables. There's like a negative, positive dimension. So we can feel negativity to positivity on a certain range, and we can feel excitement. And all emotions are basically constructed of those two ingredients in various degrees, and it's very cultural and it's very experience driven how exactly we have these emotions. And one of the examples they use is that different cultures have different emotions. So Schadenfreude is something that's inherently a German thing, which is like laughing at someone else's pain, something like that, or taking pleasure in someone's misfortune. Have you thought about the role of like emotions and feelings and how much of that is constructed by humans?
Yeah, I don't think animals have emotions in any sort of sense that humans have them.
Yeah.
So the most common objection is, well, if you step on a dog's, you're blanking on the word, not feet.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Tail?
Or let's say tail.
Paws.
The paws. That's right, the paws. But if you step on a dog's tail, it'll whimper and cry out. Yeah, it does that, but I think it's a very stimulus response driven kind of reaction. They don't have what humans have, like in terms of suffering or happiness, and just the range that humans have is just so much more complex. I mean, think of all the different emotions you could have. Not just happiness and suffering, but guilt and pride and envy and like there's so many. Animals have none of that. Humans are certainly unique in that way. One thing, the role of emotion. So something that's influenced my thinking, aside from critical rationalism, probably another philosophy that's influenced my thinking the most is objectivism. And objectivists they do ascribe a rational place for emotions. They just want to make sure that that you observe a proper, I don't want to call it a hierarchy, but there's a proper relationship between reason and emotions. So they say emotions are like lightning fast evaluations of a given situation based on your value judgments. So let's say, for example, if you're enlightened when it comes to the treatment of children and you see somebody spanking or otherwise physically abusing their child out on the street, and then that disgusts you. Okay. So that is a proper, rational, emotional response because one of your values of one of your ideas of how children should be treated is being violated. And that's why you feel disgust. So there's a proper relationship. You have a rational assessment of a situation, and the emotion returns that back to you.
I think there's also an argument in favor of the emotions being constructed, or at least based, because in this case, that anger you're feeling is not some innate programming you have, or likely not. It's more you have values that you've created, like physical harm is bad, therefore this is causing me to create anger.
Yep.
We're not born with this.
Right. I agree. I think that's also the result of creativity. But the objectivists would warn, they emphasize that the emotions are effects of your value judgments. They shouldn't be causes of it. If you try to inverse that relationship, if your mind is guided by your feelings and you use your mind to rationalize the decisions you made based on emotions, then you get into dangerous terrain. Then you achieve destruction and pain. So this kind of gets into the fun criterion that David Deutsch has suggested. I mean, I should say there are things I appreciate about it. So one thing I appreciate about it is that it, contrary to basically any other school of thought, it says that explicit and inexplicit ideas and conscious and unconscious ideas, one is not automatically better than the other. We shouldn't set up an authority like rationalistic people might say explicit ideas are always better than inexplicit ones. Or more romantically inclined people might say, well, the inexplicit ideas or the emotional ideas are always better than the explicit ones because intuition is key or whatever. And David says, well, no, they all have their place, and what you really want to be is unconflicted. And objectivists have this notion of being unconflicted too. They have this notion that I think they call it a well-integrated mind, where all your ideas are in harmony, and you're not in conflict with yourself about what to do next, for at least not permanently in conflict with yourself about what to do next, for example. So that's one thing I like about the fun criterion. Another thing I like about it is that the error correction angle, that if you do something and it's fun and then it stops being fun, that's a signal. It tells you that there's some problem, there's some error that you could correct, or you could divert your attention somewhere else and do something else. Whereas if you do something that's not fun from the beginning and you do it anyway, you never get that signal. There's never a change. And so then you miss out on the errors that you could correct. So that's something I like about it too. But what I'm missing though in the fun criterion is that it, unlike objectivism, it doesn't emphasize that there's a problem. Like fun is an emotion, right? But if you don't phrase it carefully, you run the risk of the fun criterion really just devolving into whim worship. So this is why I think it's worth combining it with this objectivist insight that yes, emotions have their place in a rational mind, but they need to be in the proper order. It's the emotions have their place, but make sure you're not driven by your emotions. And so I would combine
this is
those
interesting,
two.
man. I liked it a lot. I also spent a lot of time thinking about the fun criterion. I really loved that video, and I've made my own conjectures based on it. What I actually don't think of as fun as an emotion, but as a state of just unconflicted awareness. And actually, I draw from the non-dualistic philosophies that also describe this state of just awareness and being unconflicted. So inner peace is sometimes how they call it. I know it's a bit woohey and maybe hard to make explicit in some cases, but I think it's a description that then removes this indeed positive argument from the equation, where you're not saying fun is this feeling, but no, it's the absence of all negative feelings. That's how I would, I guess, look at it. Does that mesh with your view?
Yeah, I guess it does. I suppose you could consider fun. Maybe you could consider it the feeling that you get in a state of unconflictedness.
Like the
if that
flow
makes
state
sense.
is often.
Yep.
Well, is also ascribed to this. Like when you're in flow, I mean, it's super enjoyable, I guess you could say, afterwards. But are you feeling something as a pleasure in the moment? No, I think it's more just like, oh, you're doing the thing and for its own sake. Doing it for its own sake. I love that succinct explanation of the fun criterion.
Yep.
Do you think there is some morality to be derived from critical rationalism in general, like what we should put our efforts towards doing? Because I rarely hear moral statements coming from this crowd.
Yeah, they don't prescribe a lot. I mean, Popper said that we have a duty to be optimists and not to prophesy evil. I remember that. And then there's the Deutschian moral imperative not to destroy the means of error correction.
Yes.
Once again, I think of objectivism. Objectivists would certainly argue that you have a duty to think, you have a responsibility to think, you have a responsibility, especially if you live in an irrational society, which we all do. You have a responsibility to pronounce judgment, which protects the clarity of your thinking against this irrational background.
Yeah.
So there's this one quote by Ayn Rand that goes something like, you're free to evade the responsibility of thought, but you're not free to evade the consequences of doing that. Something like that.
Oh, interesting.
So at the end of the day, you can choose not to think if you want. That's the first and most basic choice every human being has to make. Do I want to think or not? Do I want to think or do I want to evade? And her clear answer is, well, you should think. You should think things through. You should be honest. Which, you should be truth seeking. You can't be truth seeking and dishonest at the same time, right? Honesty is a key driver of science and any philosophy or any good philosophy. But yeah, that's certainly an objectivist insight. You should think, and you should, yeah.
Yes. I think it's interesting. That also meshes quite well with indeed the critical rationalism, but also existentialism. I'll just assume that you are not too familiar with it, but it's also the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, and he also exactly states this: like, there is no inherent meaning in life. The only thing that is inherent is that we are able, or we have agency, and we are therefore have a choice to think, to act in the world, to take responsibility for things, and to do things. So he says that's the fundamental aspect of life, and then he takes it even a step further in his definition of existentialism, and he says we should do things also because inaction or avoidance of responsibility also means we're projecting to society then a weakness or a disingenuousness, and that there's an moral obligation in that. So you should always act in alignment with your own values and your own reason. I find that maybe a bit too far, but I'm curious what you think of claims like that.
And that sounds good to me. That you should always act in accordance with your values. Yeah, that sounds good. And different people.
No, this aspect I'm also completely on board with. I'm just like the extension for society's sake. Because if you
no, it's for your own sake.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and because it being if you're doing it for something else, you're making also again disingenuine, and you're introducing an intermediary. Well, I must say Sartre was also a socialist, so this is probably coming from this this dimension as well. But I do really appreciate also you sharing the objectivist philosophies a little bit more. It's one of the ones I've not read into myself as much, but I do think
it's really good.
A lot of these are complementary.
Yeah, it's really good. If you want to learn more about this stuff, I actually recommend reading Ayn Rand's nonfiction first. A lot of people start with the fiction books, and they're really good. I haven't read all of them, but I read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. But they're really long, and they have a lot of different characters, and there's a lot more work to do to actually understand her philosophy from reading the fiction. And in her nonfiction, she makes it I thought she made it a lot more accessible and easier to understand and digest. And there's some great stuff.
Do you have any specific books?
Virtue of Selfishness is good. Philosophy Who Needs It. Those are both for the New Intellectual is another title, I think. You can't really go wrong with their nonfiction. I think they're all good. I haven't read all of them, but almost all of them. They're really good. And you get things that you don't get from critical rationalism, like more of the normative kind of, well, what should you actually do with your life? You know, not in like a prescriptive kind of sense, you should become an engineer or whatever. That's not what they say. There's certain values that they emphasize, like accountability and what that really means, honesty, and what the Fountainhead has a lot of great themes about honesty and what that actually means, accountability, life as the ultimate value from which all other values are derived. So selfishness in the positive sense that your life is yours to live, not the popes, not societies, not the kings. It's your life, and nobody gets to trample on it. And you should make decisions that are right for you and not act against your own values. You should never trade a positive for a negative, those kinds of things.
What I find interesting is that this notion of like almost radical selfishness or doing everything for yourself, even being kind to others, doing that for yourself, is apparent in non-dualistic philosophy as well. So even the most spiritual philosophies, they say like doing something for someone else is just creating this self-image that you want to protect and strengthen, etc. And it's disingenuous. You should just do things because it makes you feel good, and that's the only way to be genuine or authentic. That's why I do enjoy reading the multiple philosophy, because there is a lot of overlap, and I think it's interesting to highlight those.
When you say non-dualistic, what does that mean?
So originally it's like the Buddhist and Zen philosophy, where this state of nirvana and being in complete Zen. So watching your thoughts, or at least being aware of the fact that there is not faculty of you that is your awareness. So I guess consciousness could be close or synonymous to it. And then there's the things that are arising within your mind. So your thoughts, your feelings, etc. And just being aware that you are only your awareness. You should not identify with your feelings as you're feeling something bad, but you are not depressed, right? Not identifying with this image. So it's getting rid of the idea that there's two separate selves, and you kind of have to suppress some of yourself in some instances, and in other instances you let it take the reins. No, you're just always aware that there's multiple processes going on inside of your brain. And I think in the most succinct articulation of non-dualistic philosophy that I like is Anthony de Mello, who's written on this topic in a very accessible way.
And now those are philosophies, or they're religions?
No, not religious at all, actually. So yeah, more philosophies. Yeah.
So Buddhism is not a religion?
I mean, there is no deity or god present in the books that I've read on non-dualism. There's not a central authority that's pointed to.
The Buddha is not viewed as an authority?
So I've read in Anthony de Mello, so the modern incarnations of non-dualism. So also like Sam Harris is Waking Up. This is that's also non-dualism. This rational idea of viewing the mind as just a vessel where things happen, and not as the you. The you is your awareness, your consciousness, but nothing else than that.
Doesn't Sam Harris deny that the self exists at all?
I've not read Sam Harris, to be honest with you, man. Well, at least I recall that he doesn't believe in free will, which then immediately turns me off to the lessons that he might impart.
So that's where kind of my spidey senses tingle. Yeah. This idea of nirvana and this kind of utopia, I get a little queasy when I hear those things. They don't sound compatible with reason. They sound mystic.
I have written on it a little bit. I'm writing on a little bit. I could share it with you. But I think there's actually a lot of overlap where the fun criterion, or the state of just unconflictedness, is, I think, identical to that state of awareness and just not identifying with your thoughts and just being present.
Okay. Interesting.
And there's a couple more overlaps, but I'll make a proper little essay at one point where I try to concretely tie in critical rationalism to these notions as well. And I of course might be charitable and like skipping over things that are a bit woohee, but yeah, I'm still coming at it from a primarily critical rationalist angle when looking at those things. I think maybe to tie it out, a fun question related to, I guess, objectivism as well a little bit, because there's explanations that Ayn Rand gives of also beauty. Have you looked into the similarities between Deutsch's articulation of subjective and objective beauty and Ayn Rand's explanation of beauty?
Well, Deutsch says that beauty has to do with like interspecies communication, right?
Yeah, attraction, yeah.
and like the bees had to find or the flowers had to find a way to be attractive for bees, and the best way to do that was to embody objective beauty.
Yes.
I'm just recapping just to make sure that I'm remembering it.
Yeah, but you're correct. Yeah.
And it was people face the same problems because the communication gap that species face is the same that individual people face with each other. Right?
Yeah. Deutsch might be even far greater. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, and then he ties it in also with his idea of this non-arbitrariness of good explanations, right? Hard to variness.
Yeah, hard to vary.
That good design is hard to vary. Yeah, I mean, Ayn Rand has written quite a bit about art. And she emphasizes a lot this Aristotelian notion of art, where the purpose of art in that conception is essentially to show the glory of man, to show how man can be and how he ought to be. You don't portray man as this kind of pathetic little being who can't help what who can't help what happens to him. Instead, you portray man as a heroic being who's in charge of his life and of his own decisions, and who has free will and achieves the values that he wants to achieve, and is the master of his life.
Yes, in an idealized form, right? Like even exaggerating beyond what is humanly capable.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember in any other fiction that I have read that people ever did anything superhuman. But to her, the idea is that when you consume a piece of art, and when you see beauty like that, the idea is it helps you take a break from your struggle to achieve your own values. And it shows you a world in which your values have already been achieved. And seeing that achievement gives you the energy to continue pursuing them in real life. Unfortunately, there's actually very little art nowadays that meets that purpose. I mean, most movies, let's say, that you watch or paintings or whatever, they don't show that. They show it can still be really entertaining. I was thinking about this the other day. Breaking Bad, one of the greatest TV shows ever made. I don't know if you saw it or not, but
of course, yeah.
But it definitely does not meet that purpose of art, because quite the contrary, it does not show the glory of man. It kind of shows the cesspool of what man can become. It's still a really entertaining show, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't meet that. If I have to think of so one movie that comes to mind is Whiplash. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's about a young guy who wants to become the best drummer in the world. Just this aspiration alone shows you that it might meet that purpose of art that Aristotle and Ayn Rand had in mind.
Yes, it's interesting. I didn't also ever make that direct connection that art or just can serve the purpose of being inspirational or motivational of an ideal to attain. But this also it makes a lot of sense. Even my girlfriend, she says that nowadays, like a lot of the cartoons or movies, or they don't have clear good guys and bad guys anymore. They don't have clear hero arcs where someone is winning and someone is losing. It's a bit ambiguous and relativist, and that also please weakens a bit the message.
Totally undercuts movies. The good in favor of the bad. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I was saying this. So recently, I've been getting into rollerblading. And I did it a lot as a kid, but now I'm trying to kind of revive that interest. And then what you do when you learn something like rollerblade, like any knowledge-laden activity, is like a lot of errors, like tying this back into critical rationalism, right? A lot of error correction, repeat error correction to improve your skill until mastery, if you want to take it that far. And so I watched these tutorials online, right? And it kind of struck me, it's a little bit like art, at least in the sense that, well, if I go on Instagram and I see like really good rollerbladers, that inspires me to get better at rollerblading. But you don't see this in any generalized form anymore, where like, what movie can you point to that inspires you to become a better man, period?
Absolutely. It's more about being guilty for the unfair advantages you've been given,
right?
Or that everything is relative and people don't have it as good as you. This is more portrayed.
Yeah. So there's a vacuum there that needs to be filled. I hope that people make more. I see it in bodybuilding. That's one of the last.
I was going to go there.
Yeah, that's one of. I know that you're a bodybuilder and I'm a fan. I that's one of the last remaining art forms that's really remains true to this purpose, that it shows man how he can and ought to be.
Yes, I love professional bodybuilding and following it for the reason that it's really about objectively attaining the best physique you can, and putting that against other physiques and then seeing what they can do. Not all the brakes are off. Like, of course, that means also you can take steroids, etc. Fine, but that still means that you can go to this really idealized person, and then therefore, like, wow, that is something you want to aspire to at least look a bit like. When I came up in bodybuilding, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the guy that I always was. Oh, I think I could look like him, or I want to look like him. In bodybuilding, it's really clear. You have these role models, and this, I didn't make that connection as explicitly before as when you just articulated it. But art, that is art in a sense. Just having ideals in any skill. It doesn't have to be just a painting or a picture or film, etc. It can really be an example of, wow, excellence, I guess.
So is he your favorite bodybuilder, Arnold?
Ooh, good question. He package deal? Yes. So of course I got into bodybuilding for the physique aspect, but then of course you learn about the personality behind it and this incredible life that Arnold Schwarzenegger has had, which is also like full of agency and creativity and excellence in multiple domains, showing how strong people are. Like, yeah, as an all-round human, he's in like my top 5 favorite, I would say. And physique-wise, also incredible because I'm a bit taller as well. So that oh yeah, maybe I could look a little bit like it. That kind of pops in. But his genes were his chest genetics,
fantastic.
Like, those are unmatched.
Yeah.
And how about yourself? Do you have specific?
Yeah, like I would agree. Arnold's physique, and also what you said about his life. Yeah, he has lived a truly original life. He lived his own life, nobody else's. And that's something only few people can say. But yeah, in terms of physique, I think Arnold looked great. I liked Frank Zane's physique a lot. I don't really know much about the guy or his training methodology or anything. I've seen there was somebody, he's like really into some mystic stuff. I don't know. But so there's something iffy there. As a thinker, I think Mike Mentzer, definitely. Because he was an objectivist bodybuilder.
You've put me onto that a bit.
Yeah, and he's written books about bodybuilding. You can tell that they're really influenced by objectivism. And it's like when you look at old pictures of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 1970s, I'm guessing that those inspire you to become a better bodybuilder, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if Frank Zane appeals to you more, you think, because he's maybe similar in structure to you, and therefore that idealization makes more.
I just like how it looks. I just like how he looks. I like how they both look. I mean, Frank Zane, I guess it's just not. He was never quite as big as Arnold, right? He never had that imposing, like towering physique. He was just very lean, very aesthetic looking, in my opinion. Proportions, beautiful. Symmetry, beautiful. Just wow. I mean, there's a perfect body. Probably not naturally achievable for most people. But then Arnold's is obviously not naturally achievable. It's just way too big, way too much muscle to be achievable naturally. But there's just something just so pleasing to the eye about their physiques, and again this heroic thing that they're strong men. Like as a young man, you can look up to that, and that inspires you. That's so important for young men to have. And then you compare it to, I have a friend who quit Instagram because she felt intimidated by Instagram models.
Yeah.
And that tells me a completely different story, because imagine somebody who, unlike us, when he looks at old pictures of Arnold Schwarzenegger, he's not inspired by them. He's jealous. What does that tell you about that person?
That they've been told that I cannot aim for stuff, right? Yeah, that they're not universal, that they do not have the agency to achieve what they can. I think that at least that's what I get out of it. How do you read into that?
Yeah, I agree. That
there's self-limiting beliefs.
Self-limiting, and there's some objectivists would call it envy, in the sense of hating the good for being the good, or in this case, hating the beautiful for being beautiful.
Yeah.
And they don't want I have trouble putting myself in that mindset, but I guess they can't see themselves attaining that standard ever, and so they don't want anybody else to have it either.
Yep.
I guess that's what it comes down to.
It could also be a stacking of dominoes. I can imagine that if you're young in life and like not in a particular situation that you find desirable, and there's many avenues where you see people excelling in ways that you think are hard to attain, that then it's overwhelming, right? Like, because sure, that Instagram model looks amazing, but she probably is not also as smart as the individual there, or as skilled as this individual. And you do have to choose one avenue, or at a time at least, to master. I could see it as some sort of cognitive overload.
Possibly. Maybe it has to do something with, young girls are told from a young age that they have to be emphasize being pretty and skinny, and like a lot of pressure is put on them. So maybe she felt that same pressure and she was reminded of that when she saw those fitness models. It just reminds me of this whole new thing about plus size models.
It's a new old thing now.
It's
I
not
think
the
Ozempic
first time.
killed it. What I meant is, I think Ozempic already kind of killed this fad. That's
Oh, I see what you mean. Well,
yeah.
It's just an example of the, speaking of art, I could see an ad, or a commercial, like a commercial from a modeling agency. I could see that being, they're not just selling some piece of clothing. They're saying, this is what you could become. This is what you could look like if you buy this.
Yeah.
But it's not just the commercial nature of it. It's the artistic nature of it too. This is the person you could become if you buy this. This is how you could look, or you could look a little bit better. That was the whole point of modeling, that you could show people how they could look better. And with plus size modeling, this whole idea is being corrupted. They're not interested in showing how a person could be or ought to be. They're only interested in showing how people are and how flawed they are. And it's totally unfair, and it's a corruption of beauty. And yeah, it's not good.
Agree. It's interesting because sales has always been about like selling the idea or the vision or the image of something, and not the utility itself. Like, that's like sales class 101. They will teach you this. Like, sell me this pen. Okay, I need to create a situation and that this person feels like they need a pen. I'm not going to actually highlight the utility in it. All right, Dennis, that was a very pleasant conversation. I really want to thank you for being the first guest on the podcast, and I hope perhaps we can speak again in the future.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be fun.
Thanks, man. Have a good one. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dennis as much as I did. If you are curious to learn more about how the mind works and Dennis's theories on this, I can highly recommend his book, A Window on Intelligence. In addition, he regularly publishes blog posts on his website, from coding to philosophy to whatever else interests him. You can find links to that, but also to all the other resources we discussed today in the show notes. If you'd like to hear more interviews like this, please consider subscribing. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.